I was the middle of 9 children. I was born in 1928, back before the Depression, back before World War II, and I have lived to see a lot of things. The T-model Ford, we owned one of those at one time. My dad always had a good job. He worked for Gulf Oil, and I never knew what a depression was. My mother was an outstanding woman. She raised all of us kids, and she played basketball and softball and all these sports, and my dad would coach the teams, and I would be the babysitter. I had a sister that was 11 years younger than I was, and I always got to take care of her while my mother played baseball. I went to the same school all my life. I graduated in 1946, and I decided that I wanted to be out on my own and get a job, and so I did. And I went to work first in a factory where I sewed sacks to put feed in them. I sewed one end of them, and then they sewed the other end when they filled them with the feed. I worked there for about 3 months, and I had a friend that I had been friends with since I was in the 5th grade of school, and she and I decided that we were going to change jobs, and we were going to get a job canning oil. During the war, there was no cans to can oil in, so they canned them in paper cans and motor oil. So she and I both got on at this place, and we worked there until the war was over in '47, and they decided that they were not going to can oil in paper cans anymore. They were going to do it in metal, and the women said that they wanted to have a raise, and they said that they weren't going to give them a raise, and they said that they were going to quit if they didn't, and so we all quit. And she and I went to St. Louis, and she had an aunt and uncle that was living in St. Louis, and she had written Aunt Viola, as we called her, and asked her if we came out to St. Louis, if she would rent us a room in where they lived, and we would pay her rent. And so she wrote back and said that she would. So we caught the train and we went to St. Louis. We started looking for jobs, and it was right after the war, and it was really kind of hard to find jobs because all of the soldiers were coming home and wanting jobs. And so the first place I worked at, I did duck decoys. Duck decoys are decoys that hunters use to put them out on the water, and then they have a deal that they make a noise that sounds like a duck, and when they do, it calls these other ducks, and they would shoot them. And we painted them, and I painted the eyes. And we just got tired of doing that. We decided that we was going to find another job. And we got a job typing dog tags, you know, like the guys wore in service. And we did that for a while. And then we went to work for a cat's drugstore. And I was keeping books over the fountain, and on weekends when they would be busy, I would have to work service, which was making sundaes and milkshakes and everything. Louise was just working as a waitress. They had a park out in St. Louis. It was called Forest Park. They had a zoo out there, and they had a swimming pool, and this carnival came to town. And Louise and I wanted to go to this carnival. And we asked Aunt Viola and Uncle Alvin if they would go with us, because back then 2 girls our age didn't go places like that by themselves. They just wouldn't let them do it. So we went to, they went with us out there, and we went in, and Louise and I was walking around, and Aunt Viola said, "Now, Elvin and I are going to be right in this area whenever you all get through with your riding and all, y'all come back here." So we were walking around looking, and all of a sudden, these 2 tall, good-looking guys were standing down in front of this sideshow, which at this one, they had this guy out there that was sticking a needle in his arm, and I did what you did, and Francis said that I bumped him, but I didn't bump him. He turned around and he bumped me, and we never did settle that disagreement of who bumped each other. But he said, what are you 2 girls doing? And we said, "We're just at the carnival enjoying ourselves." And they said, "Would you all ride some rides with us?" And we said, "Oh, no, we don't know y'all. We couldn't ride rides. We don't do that." So we turned and walked off. They started following us. They followed us all around, and we walked over to where Louise's aunt and uncle were supposed to be. And so we walked up to them, and they just followed us right on up where they were. And Francis said, "My name is Frances Stipe, and I'm from McAllister, Oklahoma." And she said, "McAllister? My goodness, I was raised at Ada." And he said, "Well, then we're just not like neighbors." Said, "Do you care if we ride rides with these girls? I feel like I know you." And she said, "Well, no, I think it would be fine if you rode rides with those girls." So we started riding some rides with them. Well, I didn't like Francis. He had a tooth out in the front where he had been at a party when he was about 12, and someone had pulled a chair out from under him, and he had hit his mouth on somebody's knee, and it killed his tooth, the nerve in his tooth, and it had turned black. And when he went into the service, they pulled that tooth, and he was snaggletooth. And Francis always said that's why I didn't like him, was because he had that snaggletooth. But anyway, he fell instantly in love with me, and I didn't like him. But he wrote me some of the sweetest love letters, and Louise and I would read them and laugh at him. That's awful, I know. But Louise's aunt died. That was in April that Francis had his 16th birthday, April the 14th. When I met him, he said, "How old are you?" And I said, "I'm 19." And he said, "I'm 19 too." Well, he had on a uniform and everything, and he looked 19. So I didn't ever doubt that he wasn't. And so that was in April, and Louise's grandmother died in July, and we had to come back to Smackover for the funeral. We didn't get back to St. Louis until about the middle of July, and we went back to work. And that Saturday, Louise came back where I was and said, "Guess who I just saw?" And I said, "I don't know who." And she said, "That Francis Stipe." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yeah." He said he wanted to talk to you. And I said, "Okay. When I get through, I'll go out there and see him." So I went out there where he was, and he was sitting in a booth. And when I walked up to the table, he smiled real big, and that tooth in the front was just shining. And I guess it just hit me, I don't know, but I fell in love with him anyway. And he told me, he said he wanted to, have a date with me. And I told him that I didn't want to go anywhere. And he said, I'll do anything you will do if you'll just go somewhere with me. I said, okay, let's go swimming. So he said, okay, I have to buy a swimming suit, but we'll go swimming. So he went and left and bought him a swimming suit and came back. And we went out to Forest Park to the swimming pool. Louise went home. She left me with him. And so we went swimming, got out of swimming, and he rode the streetcar with me home and told me that he'd see me the next day. But I didn't work on Sundays. And the next day, he came over to Louise's aunt's house. And we went somewhere, I don't know exactly where, but we started dating. That was after July the 15th. And he told me that he asked me to marry him. And I said, you're going to overseas. And he said, I know, but I want to marry you before I go. And I said, I don't know, but I went to told Louise what was going on, and she said, well, why don't you and he get married? I think you all just go together. And I said, okay. So I told him, I said, okay, we'll get married. So he wrote his daddy. We went up to the, in St. Louis to the courthouse to get a marriage license. And they asked me how old I was, and I said I was 19. And he said, the guy looked at Francis and said, how old are you? And Francis, he told him that he was 18, and he thought that he only had to be 18 to get married. He didn't know he had to be 21 or have his permission from his dad, even though he was in the military. And so he told him, he said, I can't issue you a license because, he said, you're not old enough. You have to have your dad's permission to get married. So Francis wrote his dad a letter. He told his dad in the letter that he wrote him that if he didn't give him his permission that we were going to get married anyway, but we would like to make it legal. And Francis's daddy wrote back and told him that if he could get married without his signature, for him to go right ahead and do it, but that he wasn't going to sign anything for him to get married. He was too young. So Francis said, well, we'll just go over to Granite City, Illinois, to the courthouse, and we'll get a license there, and we'll get married in Granite City. And so his uncle died, and he had to come home. And he run up to where his dad was. He told me this, and told his dad, said, don't say anything about that letter I wrote you. I've changed my mind. And he said he didn't want to fight with all of his brothers, which would have been Gene, Jack, and Clyde. And anyway, that weekend came, we were just going to tell him that he was 21. And this old guy where we went to get our license, Louise and I had on high heel shoes, and we had to walk. We didn't have any cab. We didn't have any money. We borrowed $45 from Louise to get married because Francis was supposed to have gotten paid, and he didn't. They usually when a holiday falls on the weekend, they pay them on Friday. Well, they didn't that time. And so we borrowed $45 from Louise to get married. And we was walking over to Granite City from St. Louis, and we had to walk across this bridge. My feet was hurting me so bad I couldn't hardly stand it. And Louise said hers was too. And I said, well, why don't we just change shoes? Because we both wore the same size shoe. So we changed shoes, and we went on, and we got over and we found the courthouse, and we got our license. And this old guy looked at me and said, how old are you? And I said, I'm 19. And he said, what's your birth date? And I told him, January the 25th, and I was born in 1928. And he looked at Francis and said, how old are you? And Francis said, I'm 21. And he said, and when were you born? And Francis just went blank. Louise started to flirting with this old boy that was issuing the license, and so he looked back at Francis and said, when did you tell me you were born? And Francis told him whenever it was. It wasn't 31. He was born in 1931, so it would have been 3 years before that. And anyway, we got our license, and we started looking for a Baptist church. And we couldn't find one anywhere. Everything was Catholic in St. Louis. And anyway, we finally found this Methodist church. And we went in, and there was a preacher there. And there was a guy out in the vestibule cleaning and all. And Louise and Francis and I went in, and we had our marriage license, and we told him that we wanted to get married and asked him if he had married us. Well, he must have talked to us for an hour and a half. He tried to talk Francis out of marrying. And so Francis told the man, the preacher said no, said she's the only girl I ever saw that I wanted to marry, and I want to marry her. So he said, okay, I'm going to marry you all. So he said, but you've got to have 2 witnesses. And Louise said, well, I'm one of them. And she said, and there was a young man out in the vestibule cleaning when we came in. So she walked out there and asked this guy, said, would you be a witness for a wedding? And this guy told her, said yes. And on our marriage license, his name was Thayne, Thayne. That's all I remember. I don't remember his last name, Thayne something. And he signed the papers with Louise, and he married us. And that was August the 30th. And I had started dating him about the middle of July. And I must have had 10 dates with him before I married him. We got married in August, and it was November that he went to, had to go, they were shipping him to China. And they were giving him a furlough of 15 days before they shipped him to China. And this he told me, he said, we're not going to McAllister. He said, we're just going to your folks. He said, I would rather face your mother and daddy than my family. He said, so we're not going to McAllister. So we went to my mother's and daddy's, and we stayed the 15 days before he had to go to leave. And my mother and daddy, of course, you know, Francis, he just won them over immediately. And they thought he was the grandest thing ever was. And so he left for China. And I went to work in a drugstore. And Francis wrote me every day that he was gone. He wrote to me. And of course I wrote to him too. And he told me that his dad was going to write me a letter. And I got a letter from his dad, and his dad told me that if I would come to McAllister, that he would get Francis's birth certificate and he would get him out of service. But he had to do it before he was 17, which he would have been 17 in April. And this was a little bit before Christmas that he wrote me the letter. And my mother and I were in the grocery store, and she was buying stuff for Christmas, Christmas cooking stuff. And she said, I sure hate that Francis is having to be overseas. And I thought, well, now is my chance. And I said, well, he could possibly be home a little after Christmas. And she turned around and looked at me and said, what are you talking about? And I told her that Francis's daddy had written me the letter, and that he had said that if I would come to McAllister. And she said, well, you just well to go home and pack a suitcase because you're going to McAllister. And I said, Mama, I don't know any of those people. I've never met any of them. And she said, I don't care who you've met or who you haven't or what, you're going to McAllister. So I went home and I started packing a suitcase. And I told Mr. Jones, the guy that I was working for, that I had to go to McAllister to see Francis's daddy. I didn't tell him why. And so he let me off from work. And I went to McAllister. And Francis's dad wrote me a letter and told me that someone would meet me at the train station. I rode the train in. And I rode the train in. And I got off of the train and went inside the train depot. No one was there. No one was there. And I thought, well, now what do I do? Stupid little old country girl, you know, never done anything, been anywhere, just, I didn't know much of anything. And so I knew enough that I knew that they had these lockers in these train depots that you could put a quarter in it and get a key and lock your suitcase up in it. And so that's what I did. And about that time I turned around and Gene was coming in the door at the train depot, and he walked over to me and he said, "Are you Billie Jean?" I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, Pop said for me to pick you up and bring you to his house." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "You don't have no suitcase?" I said, "You weren't on time." I said, "It's over in the locker." And he said, "You got a key?" And I handed him the key, and he went over and got my suitcase out of the locker and put the key wherever it was supposed to be. And so we went to Pops's house. And we got to Pops's house, and Jack was there and Clyde was there, and they were all there, and I was just scared to death. I remember that Marie and Freddie came to town, and they insisted that I was going home with them. And Freddie and I talked to each other. We both talked in our sleeps. And he was in one bedroom, and she and I was in another one, and we woke her up talking to each other in the night. And Marie told me she thought I was the prettiest thing she had ever seen in her life. And I said, "Marie, I was never pretty." She said, "You are absolutely wrong." And I said, "Well," I said, I've never felt like I was pretty because my brother always told me I was ugly." And she said, "Well, your brother always told you wrong." And so I stayed there for 2 weeks, and I went back to Arkansas and went back to the drugstore and was working, and I had a letter from Francis, and he said, Pops wrote me a letter and told me that he was getting me a discharge. I was going to be coming home, and he told me that he was supposed to be home around his birthday, which was April the 14th. And he said, I'll call you from China and let you know when I'm gonna leave, when I'll get there and everything. So I told Mr. Jones that Francis was gonna call me on his telephone. I didn't, we didn't have any phones. And he said, Mr. Jones said, well, that's fine if he calls you on my phone. I don't mind. Well, he told everybody that came in that drugstore that Francis was going to call me from China. Of all places, I was going to get a call from China on his telephone. And so Francis called me, and I could hardly hear what he was saying or vice versa. It was the line was just so weak and everything. And he told me that he would be home this certain day, and he would come in at the train depot at Smackover. I was at Smackover then, not McAllister. And so he told me about what time, and so I checked with the train deal to see what time a train was supposed to be coming in from there, and they gave me the time. And so I was standing there in the drugstore, and all of a sudden I heard this freight train. I heard the train whistle going, whoo, whoo, and I looked at Mr. Jones, and he looked at me, and I said, do you think that's the train he's going to be on? He said, you better get on down to that train depot. So I left out of the train station, and I looked up, and there come Francis. He saw me about the same time. And there we were running down the street of Smackover, and we just run into each other's arms. And so he was home then for 2 weeks. We were at Smackover for 2 weeks. And we went to his folks then. And I think he was really scared to go home, but he was going home. He was going to stay with me regardless of what he did. And so we got to McAllister, and they were all in a good humor with us and everything. And well, a couple of times we had letters from Gene, and he wanted to get Francis a divorce because Francis was too young to be married and all of that. And Francis wrote him a letter back and said, I want you to read this before I mail it to him. And he told Gene that he wanted him to leave us alone, that we were happy, and that he didn't care how young he thought he was, that he was going to stay married to me, and he might as well to leave us alone. At that time, Gene was a lawyer, and he was going to get him an annulment. And so we never did hear anything else along those lines then. Francis went to work for a shoe store, and he worked at a shoe store for a while, and then he went to work for Montgomery Ward's, and he had worked for them for a while, and he started to school at Wilburton, and he had to find a job that he could work and go to school too, which he did. And I got pregnant with Janice. And I was sick the whole 9 months I carried her, and I only gained a half a pound of weight. And it was awful the way we lived. We didn't have anything. We had nothing but just sheets and pillowcases and dishes and clothes. That's all we owned, period. We didn't have a car. If we went anywhere, we walked or rode the bus, one or the other. And then we had just got settled down, and Janice was about 8 months old, and the Korean War broke out, and and Francis had joined the 45th at McAllister to get the little check that they paid him to be in it. That was the only reason why he did that, was to get that check, because we didn't have any money for anything. I mean, you talk about living sparsely. We lived very sparsely. And anyway, he told me, he said, I'm going to apply for, to get out of the 45th, because he said, I know they're going to mobilize and they're going to be sending a unit to Korea. And he said, I do not want to go to Korea. Well, sure enough, they wouldn't discharge him. They wouldn't let him out. And in a couple of weeks, we got a notice that they were going to mobilize the 45th unit, the date and everything. And we had gotten us an apartment and had a refrigerator that we were paying for. That's all the furniture we had, and the apartment was furnished, except we had bought a refrigerator. And we sold the refrigerator and everything, and got rid of everything we had, and I was going to go to El Dorado and stay with my mother and daddy. And so Francis said, no, just stay where you are for a little while. I was staying with his dad and Rosie, his stepmother, and he said, I will find a place for us to live, for you to live in Louisiana. So he called me and told me that he and Leroy Painter had found a place for Charlene and I to live. And Charlene was going to come too, and he wanted me to come too. And he said, you can ride the train, and it was to Leesville, Louisiana. And we got down there, and they had us a room in this with this family that had about 6 kids, and we had a bedroom each upstairs. And honest to God, the partitions between the walls, if you turn the lights on at night in one room and left them off in the other one, you could see what the other couple was doing in the other room. So we just automatically turned our lights off at night when we went in the bedrooms. And I had Janice, and I couldn't keep her milk because all these kids with this other family that, we were renting from. So Charlene told me, she said, Billy, I am going to keep the car, and you and I are going to go to DeRidder or Leesville one, and we're going to find us a place to live. And so we got up that morning, and she took Leroy to work. Well, it started raining, and she said, I don't know how to drive in this rain. And I said, Charlene, I don't even have a driver's license. And she said, well, you're going to have to drive the car till we can get it out of where we're living. We were living out in the woods on an old dirt road that was just awful. And we got in the car. Of course, there was no car seats for babies or anything. And, she was holding Janice in her arms. Now, we were driving along, and all of a sudden, this dang stream of goats started across the highway. And I said, Charlene, what am I going to do? I said, I don't know what to do. I said, if I stop the car, we're going to be stuck here. She said, just blare it through them. We don't care if we kill them. So I just gunned the car, and they all got out of the way, and we got through. And when we got up to where the road was a decent road, she took over driving because she had a driver's license and I didn't. And we found us an apartment. And what we found was not much better than what we had, other than you couldn't see us dressing in our rooms. And it was on the front of the house, and we had a bedroom here, they had a bedroom here, and then when Leroy and Francis was at home, we had to go outside the house and around to the porch and across the porch to the bathroom. And the kitchen, we had to come in the kitchen door then. Their bedroom went into the kitchen door to the apartment that we had. And so when Leroy and Francis weren't home, weren't there, we just opened the doors and lived together. Charlene and I do. To this day, Charlene is one of my best friends. And we have had more laughs out of this journey that we made in Louisiana. And so they said they were going to send the 45th to Korea. And that was in December. And they told Francis, said they weren't going to send him. They were going to send him to Georgia. And he was going to teach a bunch of people the Morse code. That's what he had done when he was in the Air Force. And so he shipped out. We had a car. We had got a car. He told me, he said, tell Bob Griffith, you know Margaret Griffith, said tell Bob to get us help you find us a car and help you get payment set up on it. And he said, then at Christmas, whenever I have a Christmas leave, I'm going to come and get you and bring you back to Georgia. Well, I told Bob what Francis wanted to do, and he said, Billy, Margaret and I have talked it over, and what we've decided is that we've got some money in the bank drawing interest, and we're going to buy you all a car, and you can make me a payment of $50 a month and no interest. The only interest I want you to pay me is what my money would earn while it was in the bank. And that's how we got our first car. And so that was the car that we drove to Georgia. We left McAllister, and Janice was about 9 months old, and we drove to Columbus, Georgia, and we came through El Dorado, where my family lived, and it was at Christmas time, and we stopped and had visited with them a little while, and then we got in the car and we drove straight through, because Francis was supposed to be back at a certain time, and we couldn't stop to spend the night anywhere. We had to come on. And I got in the back seat with Janice, and well, we slept. And I didn't drive at that time. I didn't have very much driving experience, and so Francis drove all the way. And we got there. We found us an apartment with this woman, older woman, lived in this house, big old house by herself. And so we rented a room, and it was about the size of my bedroom. And it had a bed in it, and a table and chairs to eat off of, and a kitchen area. And that's all it was there. There wasn't a couch or anything in it. And we stayed there, and Francis drove to where he was in the, I can't remember the name of the military thing that he was in, but they would let him come home on weekends, and then he would drive back and forth. And we stayed there. We went in December, and April the 1st, they told him that they were going to send him to Korea, where the rest of his the guys was from McAllister. And so he said they were going to give him a 10-day leave or something like that, and he drove me back to McAllister. And Margaret Griffith and I drove him to Oklahoma City, and he caught a plane there, and he flew to Korea. And that was his birthday, was April the 14th, and that was about when he left to McAllister to go to Korea. And I decided that I was going to go to Arkansas and stay with my mother and daddy while he was gone. And I don't know who helped me drive down there and when, I don't remember that. But anyway, I lived with my mother and daddy while Francis was gone, and Mama took care of Janice while I worked. And they lived out in the country in the oil field, and there was a big derrick oil well in front of the house. And Janice was about, her birthday was in October, so she was a little over a year old. And she loved to go out, and she always wanted to go where that well was. And my daddy told her, said, Janice, you cannot go down that way. You go down that way and Papa is going to get you with a switch. And one day they were sitting on the front, and she was out with him, and they missed her, and there she was. They saw her little cotton head going down to where that oil well, and Daddy went after her and got a little thing of switches, and he just switched her legs and told her, said, Papa said for you not to come down here. And Janice would tell me, I wish Papa would throw them switches away. But we lived there, and I worked at a grocery store there this time. And at Fulmer's was where the name of the grocery store was. And Francis was gone for a year when he came back. He came back, and it was just about on his birthday. And Daddy and I were sitting in front of the fireplace, the stove. They had just a plain old open faced heater. You've seen those. And he and I were sitting there one morning drinking coffee. And he said, when is Francis coming home? And I said, well, he ought to be home by his birthday. And I said, this year Francis will be able to vote. And he looked at me and he said, how old are you? And I said, I'm 20, whatever I was, 23, I guess. And he said, how old is he? And I said, well, he's going to be 21, his birthday. And Daddy said, well, how old was he when you all got married? And I said, did Mama ever tell you how old Daddy was, that Francis was when we got married? And he said, no, she certainly didn't. And I said, well,
I swore her to secrecy whenever I told her how old Francis was, and so she told me she wouldn't tell it, so I guess she didn't. And he said, well, she certainly didn't tell me. And he sat there for a minute, and he looked at me, and he said, well, I just have one thing to say about it. He's always been a man since I've known him. And so Francis came home, called me, and he was at Lawton, and he wanted me to come get him. And I had never driven like that, and Daddy and I got a map, and he routed me, took a red pen and routed me away for me to go the highways. And of course the highways weren't like they are now. You know, they wasn't as many and everything. And anyway, I left, and I didn't take Jan with me. I left Jan there with Mom and Daddy, and I left, and I thought I had this map, and Daddy told me, he said, now when you drive, you're driving, and your map has a turn in it. He said, you turn your map for the way that you're going. And he said, you won't get lost. And for years after that, if I went anywhere by myself and used a map, I followed the map, and I'd turn the map on the seat the way I was turning my car to go. And I drove to Lawton by myself and didn't get lost a time. And I got there, and Francis was, I had called him and told him when I was leaving everything, and he was out on the grounds and he saw me whenever I pulled up, and he came running over to where I was, and we were there for 2 days, and he got his discharge and everything, and we came to McAllis, to El Dorado, and Mama and Daddy and Janice was sitting on the front porch when we drove up, and we got out of the car, and whenever we walked up to the porch, and Janice backed up against the wall to the porch and said, Papa, who is that man? And Francis just started to boo-hooing. And so he told her, that's your daddy. Said, you have his picture. You've been carrying it around with you all the time, telling me that was your daddy. I had taken a plastic frame. It was a leather frame that had a plastic glass over it instead of glass. And I had a picture of Francis in there, and I just gave it to her. And I told her, I said, that's your daddy, and he'll be back. I said, he's just in the military, and he'll be back. And so she'd carry that picture around with her all the time, and she would tell somebody, would say, who is that? And she'd say, that's my daddy. But she didn't know him whenever he came back. And we stayed there at Mama's and Daddy's for probably a week or something like that, and we went back to McAllister. And he went to work for Montgomery Ward on a manager's training program, and they sent him to Parsons, Kansas. And so we went to Parsons, Kansas. We had no furniture or anything. We had nothing, and we got an apartment that was furnished. And I told Francis, I said, I'm not living with this trash very long. And so I went to a sale and auction. They were auctioning this stuff off at the sale. And I bought that old Roper range that I told you I had, that I put the cookies in the bottom drawer. I bought that stove, and I bought a couch, and I bought a dinette set and a bedroom set for $75. And that was back in the days when a hamburger cost you 15 cents or a quarter. It wasn't much. And so I got that furniture, and I rented me an apartment that wasn't furnished, and we moved that furniture in, and I painted it and fixed it and everything. And we lived at, Wayne was born at Parsons, Kansas. And Montgomery Ward told him that they were going to transfer us to Little Rock, Arkansas. And they said, we're going to pay for your move, and all you got to do is just pick up your clothes, what you're going to wear, and leave. And the movers will come in, and they'll move all of your stuff. And they did. And we went to Little Rock and got an apartment and for them to move our furniture into. And I had a sister that lived at Little Rock. Her name was Onita. And I got to visit with her some. And we were at Little Rock for about a year, I guess. And they transferred us to Jefferson City, Missouri. And it was in the wintertime, and I hated it. It was just hills and curves, and it snowed and iced, and I couldn't drive whenever it was like that, and I hated it. That's the only place we ever lived. The whole 60 years we were married was that Jefferson City, Missouri. But we didn't live there but 6 months. And every time we moved, or we moved our church membership with us, we would join the church there and move our church membership. And we moved to, they moved us to Ada and as assistant manager. And he was 23 years old, and he was the youngest assistant manager that Montgomery Ward's had ever had. And we rented a house. First house we ever lived in was there. And we rented this house, and it was on Francis Street. And you know where that is at Ada? You haven't ever paid any attention to it? Well, anyway, we lived on Francis Street, and Wayne was just a baby. He probably was a year and a half, 2 years old. There was a railroad track behind the house where we lived, and that little dude would sneak out of the house, and I'd catch him walking down that railroad track, and I'd just scare the daylights out of me. And I'd go get him, and I'd spank him and tell him that he could not do that. And, you know, he continued to do it, try to do it. He was just fascinated with that railroad track. And so Mr. Gene Stipe called us, Francis's brother, and told Francis that he had a service station and a cafe at Eufaula, and that if he wanted him to run it for him. And Francis said, I will not run anything for you. He said, I will rent it from you and pay you rent, but I won't run it for you. And so he and I sat down, and we figured how many quarts of oil we'd have to sell and how many gallons of gasoline we'd have to sell to make $100 a week, because that's what he was making at that time, was $100 a week. And we figured it up, and so we decided that we would do it. So we moved from Ada to McAllister, and we moved everything we had in the back of a pickup truck, all of our furniture, and then the back part of our car. And you don't remember Dick Cable, but he was a cousin of Francis's, and it was his truck that we moved in, and he helped Francis move the furniture and everything. And so we went to Eufaula, and we rented a house there, and we lived in that house probably for 3 years. But Jan had just finished the first grade at Ada, and so she was in the second grade when we moved to Eufaula. And Wayne hadn't started to school, and Francis was working, and he was running this service station 24 hours a day. And there was people in the restaurant, and their lease wasn't up until about 3 or 4 months. And Jean told Francis, said, as soon as they leave, you can have it if you all want it. And Francis said, well, either one of us know anything about running a restaurant. And Jean said, well, you can learn. And so anyway, we took that restaurant whenever these people left. And I thought I had to stay out front and greet people and, this, that, and the other. And the first 6 months we were in it, we lost our butts. And so I told him, I said, I'll tell you, I know what the problem is. I need to be in the kitchen. And I said, the food is going out the back door as fast as I bring it in. And people are stealing. And so that's what I did. I went in the kitchen and I started to cooking. And whatever there was to do, if the toilets need cleaning, I cleaned them. We did what we had to do, and Francis was still at that little service station over there. Well, it was probably a year later, and he told me, he said, I'm going to put a trailer park behind the restaurant and the service station. And he said, I'm going to rent trailer spots to people, and it'll make some extra money. And so he did that. And then he told me that he was going to put a coin-operated laundry in. And he said, it won't be any work to it. All we'll have to do is keep it clean and change the money, and the changer, we'll have a changer. So he put in a Westinghouse laundry there. And once a week we had to go down and rob the machines where people, I don't remember what it cost a load to wash clothes, but it took several dimes. And we would rob the machines from the dimes, and then we would stock the coin changer with money, and then we would take the rest of the money and we would deposit it into the bank. And it was mostly quarters and $50. We had $50 at that time. And we went down to do that. We got it all done, and Jan and Wayne, we had let them go to the skating rink. And so we went down there to pick them up, and when we got down there was 2 boys in there, and they were being nasty to another kid, and Francis told them they needed to straighten up, and so they got nasty, and he just picked one of them up and just pitched him out the front door. Scared the daylights out of me, and the kids at that time were pulling their skates off. We told them, that they had to quit skating, and so they got their skates off, and Francis said, I had a purse, and in that purse I had all that those coins that I was going to roll and take to the bank the next day. And Francis and I and the kids was walking along, and I looked and I saw this boy walking on the other side of us, and I knew they were going to get Francis was what he was trying to do. And so he stepped out, and when he did, he kindly stepped in front of me, and I just drew that purse back and knocked him out with that purse full of coins. And the next day, Francis told some of the truck drivers that I knocked the guy out with my soccer quarters. And it was a joke because people that hoard around, they got their pay was 25 cents. And the truck drivers all got to teasing me about my quarters. And I got so mad at Francis I didn't know what to do because he had told them. But anyway, that was our only bad experience from the laundry. But he came in one day and he said, I'm going to buy a truck stop at Shikoda. And it has a restaurant and a service station, and he said, we can handle both of them. And I said, well, whatever you want to do, we'll do it. And so we bought this Midway Truck Stop was the name of it. And I ended up having to run the cafe, but we leased it as soon as we could, you know. I didn't run it very long, just off and on whenever we wouldn't have anybody in it. And so that was in about 1964, 65, somewhere in there. He came in and he said, I want to run for state senator. And I said, you want to run for state senator? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, I hate politics. And he said, well, I love it. And he said, I'm going to run for state senator. I said, you run for state senator and you're going to probably be getting a divorce. And he said, oh, you would enjoy it once we got started. I said, no. I said, I'll work at anything, but I do not want to be in politics. I said, they're all dirty and blah, blah, blah. So he said, well, if you feel that way, I won't register for it. And so I got to thinking about it. He started politicking, and I'm telling you, there was pie suppers every week. And one day I was driving from Eufaula to Shikoda to the service station, and someone was tearing down his signs that he had put up, and it made me so mad. I went home and I got a bunch of his signs, and I got me a hammer and some nails, and I was out nailing these signs up where people had torn them down. And so I started going with him to these pie suppers. And at these pie suppers, you would take a pie, and whoever bought it, you had to share it with them and eat pie with them. And that was how they politicked years ago. And they don't do it that way now. But anyway, he won all 3 counties. And that night that the election was over, we had a whole bunch of people at our house. And someone had told someone else that they weren't going to vote for Frances because I was stuck up. And they said, "What do you mean she's stuck up?" And she said, "You can tell by the way she walks that she's stuck up." So those people said, "Billy, get out here and do that walk that you do when you're stuck up." And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I didn't know anybody had said that. But anyway, I didn't know what I was going to do because Francis was going to be gone, leave Sunday evening, and he was going to be gone Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, and Wednesday night. And he was coming home Thursday. And Ireland, the guy that run the service station, worked for us, would bring money by the house at night. And I was scared to death that somebody was going to knock him in the head, and but we never did have anything like that happen. And so they started the session, and the first day of the session, they had the swearing in and everything, and Francis was sworn in as state senator, and they reapportioned the legislature. And that is, I don't know if you all know what reapportion the legislature means, but that means that they divided the counties up to make sure that they're equally, and it's still like that now. They still do the same thing now. But he served one day, and that was it. And he came home, and Jean called him and said, "Bud, I just bought a radio station here at McAllister, and I want you to run it for me." And Francis said, "Jean, I have told you that I would not work for you. I'll go in partners with you on it, but I will not work for you." So he said, "Well, why don't we just make everything we've got a partnership, and you accept my law practice?" And he said, "All the money I make on my law practice will be mine, and everything we make on all the other stuff will be half and half." And I wasn't too fond of doing that, but Francis said that we were going to do it because he thought it would be a good deal, because Jean was in a position that he could help us with, some things. And so he came to McAllister, left me at Eufaula with 2 service stations, 2 cafes, coin-operated laundry, and a trailer park to try to run. So I did it. And if I had a problem, I called Francis and I asked him, what do you think I should do? Well, he would tell me what to do. Well, everybody thought I was so smart because I was running all of these businesses and taking care of them and everything. And nobody knew I was calling Francis, and he was telling me what to do. And so anyway, he had told Jan that he would not move from Eufaula until she graduated from high school, and she was a senior that year. This was in '67. And Francis was driving back and forth to McAllister. And so he said, "We're going to build a house." And he said, when Jan graduates, he said, "We'll move to McAllister." And so we built that house on Mockingbird. And in '67, Jan graduated from high school, and we moved in that house a couple of months after she graduated. And Jan never did live in the house with us because she ran off and got married.